title card suggestion, America's Shadow Faiths. This is the sound of absolute conviction. It is the sound of an entire world being born from a single terrifying truth. America. It was not founded on peace, but on the profound, relentless ache of the human soul seeking certainty. The year is 1630. The Mayflower is decades gone and the grand experiment is underway. But the true, dark genius of this new land was not in its promise of gold or even democracy. It was in the deliberate, radical absence of ancient authority. This was not a haven of faith. It was a vacuum. And where authority dissipates, conviction rushes in to fill the void. The earliest settlements were not pockets of tolerance. They were tightly wound, isolated theological fortresses. The Puritans, the Quakers, the various European sects, they fled one tyrannical king only to enthrone a far more demanding one, their own interpretation of the divine. This psychological pressure cooker, however, was fundamentally flawed. Unlike the centuries-old churches of Europe, buttressed by state power and tradition, the American faiths were perpetually fragile. They were vulnerable to schism, to doubt, and to the arrival of the next more charismatic voice that promised a truth more perfect, more absolute. This is the seat of the American cult. It is the necessary betrayal of the very concept of religious liberty. Religious freedom in America was designed to be a protective barrier. Instead, it became a permission slip for madness. The moment the state, the final concrete arbiter of reality, stepped away from dogma, the floodgates opened. Every lonely farmer, every disenfranchised woman, every wandering preacher was suddenly handed the power to declare themselves a prophet, a new Messiah, or the final vessel for ultimate knowledge. And in a sprawling, unforgiving wilderness, haunted by the fear of the unknown and the constant threat of failure, people craved ultimate knowledge. They craved a system that not only answered their questions, but eliminated the need to ever ask another. But here is the detail that truly matters. It was the sheer physical space of the continent that turbocharged this fanaticism. In Europe, a heretical preacher might be excommunicated and jailed. In America, he packed a wagon and walked 500 miles west, establishing his own sovereign kingdom of the soul, utterly beyond the reach of Boston or Philadelphia. This capacity for absolute secession, spiritual and geographic, is the central mechanism that created the American cult as we know it. The cult leader was not merely a preacher. He was a pioneer, a builder of a new, perfect Jerusalem established in the dark green silence of the frontier. This is the birthplace of the American conspiracy, the gnawing anxiety that somewhere, just beyond the tree line, a small, fanatical group is building their own laws, their own reality, and preparing to strike at the compromised, secular world they left behind. Pause and consider this image. Imagine the 18th century Appalachian Mountains. No law, no bishop, only the sound of the wind and the voice of a man who claims direct dialogue with God. Who is there to contradict him? Who is there to tell the terrified, isolated listeners that his vision of the coming apocalypse is merely delusion? The absence of an external fact-checker became the defining trait of the American spiritual landscape. This vacuum of authority was not just an opportunity. It was a psychological weapon. It allowed the cult leader to establish the ultimate, impenetrable control, the manipulation of reality itself, insulated by the vast geography of a new nation. The paradox deepens when we consider the psychological profile of the American settler. These were not the docile, tradition-bound peasants of the Old World. They were self-selected risk-takers, imbued with a powerful, dangerous individualism. This fierce independence, celebrated as the national virtue, contained within it a terrible weakness. a susceptibility to anyone who promised to channel that self-reliance into a collective, cosmic destiny. You were a failure on your own land, join the prophet, and your failure is redefined as a trial, and your destiny is to rule the world. Your mind is fragile. The group provides an unbreakable shared certainty. The line between being a rugged individual and a self-deceiving loner was razor thin, and the charismatic cult leader knew exactly how to exploit that insecurity. The Constitution enshrined liberty. But the human mind does not always want liberty. It often craves submission to a greater design, especially when the day-to-day reality is one of grinding poverty, disease, and social alienation. The cult offered a psychological escape route: surrender your confusing individual freedom and receive back a simple, all-encompassing identity. It was a Faustian bargain, often cloaked in the grand language of biblical prophecy. This pattern, established in the colonial era, repeats itself across centuries, merely updating the language. The anxieties shift from salvation to prosperity, from revelation to governmental cover-up, but the underlying mechanism remains identical. A fragile individual, alienated from mainstream society, seeks absolute certainty in a new self-contained community, endorsed by a leader who has unilaterally declared their own divinity or ultimate authority. This freedom to choose your own absolute truth is a deeply terrifying concept, because it means you are also free to choose your own gilded, meticulously constructed prison. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. By the early 19th century, the seeds had fully sprouted. Newspapers, themselves still a relatively new and uncontrolled medium, were saturated with reports of wild-eyed visionaries, communal property schemes, and mass spiritual frenzies. The public discourse was not about finding consensus. It was about defining the enemy, the other faith that might threaten one's own fragile certainty. And this fear, fueled by the sheer number of competing prophets, only drove people further into the welcoming, controlled embrace of the most extreme movements. It was an environment that made conspiracy theories a spiritual necessity, a way to explain why the world outside the sanctuary was so corrupt. The government, the established church, the economy, all were part of the satanic deception, and only the prophet's isolated group held the true key to reality. This is the moment when religious zeal bleeds into full-blown paranoia. The stage is now set for the astonishing, violent rise of the next wave of charismatic American prophets, men and women who would claim to speak with the literal voice of God and demand the most unthinkable sacrifices from their followers. The true horror of American religious liberty is that it provided the perfect license for the most profoundly destructive forms of psychological control. The year is 1830. We must now turn our gaze to a specific, almost mythical landscape in the American Northeast, a region that did not merely tolerate dissent but actively bred prophets. This territory, spanning western New York State, became known by a strange, unsettling moniker: the Burned-Over District. Why burned over? Not by fire, but by the relentless, all-consuming flame of spiritual fervor. Revival after revival had swept through these towns, leaving behind a soil so parched of conventional belief that it was fertile only for the seeds of the truly radical. Imagine a psychological landscape stripped bare, a community that had shouted, confessed, and wept through so many spiritual crises that they were now cynical about the old churches, yet desperately addicted to the experience of revelation. They were primed to believe the unbelievable, so long as it was new, bold, and promised a final, undeniable answer. The conventional church had failed them. It offered rules, tradition, and gentle guidance. But the citizens of the Burned-Over District, hardened by the frontier and driven by that uniquely American restlessness, wanted certainty, not comfort. They wanted a God who spoke directly, not through distant texts or powdered wigs. This is where the charismatic leader steps in, perfectly adapted to the environment. The American cult leader does not merely interpret the Bible, he creates the sequel. But here is the detail that truly matters. The American system, designed for self-governance, inadvertently created the perfect legal and social shield for these new cults. Most of these movements were founded on the idea of communal property and absolute sovereignty within their physical borders. The Shakers, the Oneida community, the early movements of the Latter-day Saints, they all built separate economic and social worlds. The freedom to own property and contract business, granted by the state, was weaponized to build a self-contained prison where the leader controlled all assets, all marriages, and all information. Pause and consider this image. A simple wooden sign. You are now entering Zion. What the sign did not say was, you are now surrendering your right to question, to own, and to leave. For the average American citizen struggling with debt, loneliness, or the chaos of the outside world, this offer of a self-contained, perfect economy and a prescribed social order was intensely seductive. The cult was not just a religion, it was a comprehensive system of survival, a guaranteed job, guaranteed housing, and guaranteed salvation. But the price of admission was the total erasure of the individual self. This is the psychological heart of the transaction, the American dream, inverted. The promise of rugged individualism had often led to poverty and failure. The cult offered rugged collectivism, a shared delusion of perfection that made failure impossible, because all responsibility was transferred to the divine authority of the leader. The leaders of this era, from Joseph Smith to John Humphrey Noyes, were masters of this psychological transfer. They didn't just demand loyalty, they engineered a total dependence on their system. They rewrote history, morality, and even biology to fit their visions. The isolation provided by the vast frontier meant that outsiders could only speculate on the true nature of the practices within. Were they saints or abusers? Pioneers or prisoners? This ambiguity only fueled the paranoid curiosity of the surrounding communities. Fear is the ultimate retention mechanism, and the fear of the unknown, of what was happening behind those locked gates, kept the wider public fixated. The paranoia was not unfounded. When a leader claims a divine right to control wealth, intimacy, and even life and death, the potential for catastrophe is maximized. The same religious freedom that protected the movement's right to exist also protected its right to practice the most dangerous forms of psychological and physical control, unhindered by outside oversight. The state had guaranteed freedom, but it had not guaranteed safety from the prophets it empowered. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. We find evidence in early 19th century court records of property disputes, child custody battles, and complaints of illegal confinement, all dismissed or complicated because the practices were cloaked in the protected language of religious exercise. The government, paralyzed by its own foundational principles, hesitated to intervene. This institutional paralysis gave the prophets a green light. They understood that the First Amendment, the very bedrock of American liberty, was the ultimate tool of operational secrecy. They used freedom as a shield to build a kingdom of total authoritarianism. The next chapter in this dark history shows us the inevitable culmination of this freedom. The moment when the isolated community grows too large, too powerful, and finally sparks violent conflict with the very state that guaranteed its protection. The year is now 1844. We follow the trail west. The spiritual fire of the burned-over district was not contained. It was merely displaced. The most extreme of these new faiths, facing mounting hostility from the established populace who feared their communal wealth and radical social practices, especially polygamy, were driven from their homes. This expulsion was the final tragic irony of religious liberty. Freedom guaranteed their right to believe, but not their right to peacefully coexist once those beliefs threatened the social contract. The psychological impact of this forced migration cannot be overstated. When a community is perpetually persecuted and driven into the wilderness, the leader's claim to divine authority is not weakened. It is exponentially strengthened. The external world, the one that expelled them, is immediately redefined as the source of all evil, all compromise, and all betrayal. The cult's inner reality, no matter how bizarre or rigid, becomes the only source of truth and safety. This is the genesis of the siege mentality that defines the worst of American cults for the next century and a half. They were not just moving west. They were building an impenetrable wall of paranoia against the Gentile world. But here is the detail that truly matters. In the vast, unmapped territories beyond the Mississippi, these prophets found more than just empty land. They found a legal loophole. They established settlements, towns like Nauvoo, Illinois, that were effectively sovereign city-states operating under charters that granted them their own militias, their own courts, and their own absolute law, all cloaked under the banner of religious practice. The leaders became kings, generals, and chief justices rolled into one terrifying, divinely sanctioned authority. This was the ultimate expression of the paradox. Absolute. Religious liberty had successfully created absolute temporal tyranny. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The fear now shifts from external persecution to internal confinement. For a member of this community, leaving was no longer just a spiritual defection. It was an act of economic ruin, a social death sentence, and often a physical impossibility. The leader's power was maximized in this total vacuum. He controlled the food supply, the land deeds, the marital arrangements, and the very narrative of reality. If a man questioned the prophet, he was questioning God, and he was expelled not just from the church, but from the only functional society for hundreds of miles. Pause and consider this image. Imagine a wagon train moving slowly across the empty plains. You are cold, tired, and terrified. The only thing keeping you alive is the group. And the only thing keeping the group together is the man at the front who claims to speak for the Creator. Your mind, battered by the elements and isolation, willingly surrenders its skepticism. Doubt becomes a luxury you literally cannot afford to indulge. This emotional state, desperation cloaked in devotion, is the psychological currency of the Western cult. The ultimate confrontation was inevitable. The cult's political, economic, and military power grew so potent that they no longer fit the definition of a protected religious minority. They became a domestic threat. In 1844, when the prophet Joseph Smith was killed by an angry mob in Carthage, Illinois, it was not the end of the movement. It was the final traumatic catalyst. His death confirmed the followers' paranoia. The outside world truly was dedicated to their destruction. This moment sanctified the journey into ultimate isolation. The remaining body of the faithful fled toward the ultimate sanctuary, the barren salt deserts of the Great Basin, a place so inhospitable that the federal government was unlikely to follow. They sought a place where their faith could finally be free. Free not just from persecution, but free to enact its most extreme, controlling laws without oversight. They used the geographical freedom of the American frontier to forge a theocracy that lasted for decades, setting a horrifying precedent for every isolated, armed, and paranoiac cult that would follow them in the 20th century. This is the grim legacy of the paradox of religious liberty. By guaranteeing freedom of conscience without guaranteeing social oversight, The founding principles of America inadvertently created the perfect conditions for the construction of absolute psychological and physical prisons, hidden in plain sight. They guaranteed the right to start a church, and in doing so, they guaranteed the right to start a secluded, self-destructive kingdom. Part 2. We leave the philosophical paradox of religious freedom and travel to the geographical core of American spiritual madness. The early 19th century frontier of upstate New York. This is the setting for a massive, uncontrolled psychological experiment, the Second Great Awakening. The official histories call it a spiritual revival. We call it a psychological fever dream. Between 1800 and 1840, preachers swept through this region like a plague, demanding confession, inducing hysteria, and warning of immediate damnation. They preached not in hushed churches, but in vast outdoor camp meetings, chaotic gatherings where social norms dissolved and emotion became the only law. Imagine 1,000 people gathered under the flickering light of torches, their minds open, terrified, and utterly exhausted by the relentless demands of a vengeful God. People didn't just pray. They were struck by the jerks. They barked like dogs. They fell into trances that lasted for days. This was not quiet piety. It was a communal, public breakdown. The emotional intensity was so high, so overwhelming, that the official church was not strengthened. It was exhausted. The region became known as the burned-over district. The revivals had scorched the land so thoroughly that no normal faith could take root. What remained was a population addicted to extremity. They had been taught that constant radical change was necessary for salvation. They were now psychologically primed to reject anything stable, boring, or traditional. But here is the detail that truly matters. This region was a confluence of social anxieties unique to America. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 brought prosperity, but it also brought radical social disruption. Suddenly, isolated communities were flooded with strangers, new money, new ideas, and the gnawing anxiety of a rapidly changing world. The traditional anchors, family, local economy, and community, were being stretched to the breaking point. People craved an authority that could restore order to their chaotic lives. The established churches offered mild solutions. The prophets of the cults offered a new reality altogether. Pause and consider this image. A massive, deep-cut canal slicing through a quiet town. The sound of commerce is the sound of fear. This is the psychological opening the cult leaders exploited. They didn't just offer salvation. They offered the answer to all the social, economic, and moral chaos the Erie Canal had brought. They provided a total institution, a new society to replace the broken one. When a prophet declared that the world was ending, it resonated because for many, their familiar world was ending, replaced by the crushing forces of industrial change and a widening social gap. The leaders who emerged from this crucible were not timid. They had watched the greatest showman of the Great Awakening and learned how to manipulate a crowd. They were masters of pacing and emotional escalation. They understood that the mind, after intense exposure to fear, hellfire, and damnation, needs an immediate countermeasure of absolute certainty, immediate exclusive salvation. This period saw the rise of movements demanding everything, from the radical communal ownership of property to the outright rejection of traditional marriage. The old religious constraints were not being gently loosened. They were being violently shattered. Groups like the Millerites, who predicted the exact date of Christ's return, created a wave of mass hysteria, leading followers to sell all their property and wait on hillsides for an event that never came. The psychological consequence of the Great Disappointment in 1844 was profound. It wasn't just a failed prophecy. It was a mass trauma. Followers stripped of their wealth and facing public ridicule had two choices: admit they were utterly wrong and rejoin the cruel world that laughed at them, or double down on the delusion. Most chose the latter. They didn't abandon prophecy. They simply concluded that the prophecy was right, but the interpretation was flawed. This need to preserve the delusion at all costs provided the perfect foundation for the creation of new, more isolated and more radical sects who claimed to have the real key to the puzzle. It is in this shattered, paranoid landscape that the most powerful, controlling figures of the next century, the great cult leaders, began to recruit their first, most psychologically fragile adherents. They offered not just redemption but vindication. They offered the chance to be among the few who were actually right, even when the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward madness. This is how a failed revival birthed an ecosystem of secret societies and prophetic kingdoms. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Archival records from the time show doctors and ministers baffled by the phenomena. They couldn't diagnose the collective madness. They labeled it fanaticism, a spiritual disease. But what we see now is a mass coping mechanism against the overwhelming anxiety of a nation in rapid, uncontrolled change. The burned-over district was not a religious anomaly. It was the first clear warning that the American commitment to absolute liberty could result in the total surrender of the rational mind. We now focus on the key technique that allowed the prophets of the burned-over district to convert anxiety into absolute control. It's the process of manufacturing absolute certainty where none existed. The central figure in this process is often a young, disenfranchised individual who claims a direct physical relationship with the divine. Consider the psychological power of this claim. If the Bible is open to interpretation, leading to the chaotic disagreements that defined the revivals, then the only way to establish unquestionable authority is to declare that the book is closed, and you are the new living chapter. This is the medieval style of control, reborn on the American frontier. The prophet is the vicar of Christ on earth, wielding not spiritual authority, but tangible economic and military power. This transition from spokesman to sovereign is the most dangerous unintended consequence of the American revival. The psychological mandate for the follower was simple. If you trust the prophet, you can stop thinking. All the complexity of the modernizing world, the confusing politics, the terrifying financial risks, the moral gray areas, are wiped away. The prophet provides a simple, ancient, and rigid set of rules that eliminates the terrifying burden of individual choice. This transfer of authority is, in essence, an act of psychological suicide committed in exchange for a feeling of eternal safety. But here is the detail that truly matters. These groups didn't just use revelation to gain followers. They used it to acquire and consolidate corporate power. The concept of communal property was key. By declaring that all goods, land, and money belonged to the collective, which in practice meant the prophet, they removed all earthly leverage a member had. If you question the prophet, you lose your job, your home, your spouse, and your life savings. Religious belief was made synonymous with economic survival. This is the core conspiracy. The cloak of faith hiding an engine of absolute financial control. Pause and consider this image. A deed of land signed over to a charismatic leader, the signature of a poor farmer below it. The screen pulses with a subtle, unnerving red. The control extended further into the most intimate aspects of life. In the burned-over district, we see the rise of movements that radically redefined or abolished marriage. The prophet alone dictates who mates with whom, who raises the children, and what constitutes moral behavior. This sexual control is not about moral reform. It is about breaking the primary loyalty bond of the family unit. and replacing it with an unbreakable loyalty to the collective. When the spouse or child's fate is determined solely by the prophet's whim, the family ceases to be an independent sanctuary and becomes an instrument of the cult's power. The internal mechanism that guaranteed retention was the revelation cycle. Whenever the community faced external pressure, financial hardship or internal dissent, the prophet would receive a new revelation. This was a perfect pattern interrupt. It wasn't a defense of the old rules. It was a sudden, dramatic change of the rules themselves. This kept the followers perpetually off balance, constantly dependent on the leader for the latest divine update, and incapable of establishing a stable, personal moral center. The only certainty was the uncertainty, and the prophet was the only one who could manage it. The psychological dread escalates when we realize that the paranoia was ultimately self-fulfilling. The prophets in their sermons and scriptures constantly attacked the wicked world outside. This rhetoric created fear, which led to isolation, which led to strange practices, which finally provoked the outside world to fear and attack them. The persecution they warned of eventually arrived, justifying their darkest predictions and cementing their followers' total loyalty. The persecution became the proof of the prophecy. This is the lasting, chilling legacy of the burned-over district. It demonstrated how easily liberty can breed tyranny when unmoored from rational thought. It was here in the American heartland that men learned to use the language of freedom to build the strongest psychological prisons ever conceived. The frenzy of the revival didn't lead to a new era of spiritual health. It led to an era of absolute, unquestionable, and self-serving prophecy. Part 3. We turn now from the chaos of the burned-over district to a different, far stranger outcome of that spiritual fever. A movement built not on explosive growth but on planned, serene extinction. This is the enigma of the Shakers, a communal empire that perfected the art of isolation, sustained itself for over 2 centuries, and yet was founded on one single, biologically fatal law: absolute celibacy. How does a society thrive while actively refusing to create the next generation? This is the paradox at the heart of the Shaker story, and it is a terrifying study in psychological replacement. The Shakers, formerly known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, followed a woman named Ann Lee. Her followers called her Mother Ann. She was not a minister's wife or a scholar. She was an illiterate English factory worker who claimed to be the female manifestation of Christ, the long-awaited second coming. Her message was shockingly simple and utterly radical. The source of all evil, all sin, and all suffering was the sexual act. Therefore, to achieve heaven on earth, the faithful must stop procreating. They must stop touching. Ann Lee did not offer comfort. She offered a surgical solution to human suffering. Cut out the desire that causes the pain. This resonated deeply with a Puritan culture deeply anxious about sex, and it offered the ultimate escape to women trapped in cycles of poverty and childbirth. The cult was an economic sanctuary and a physical refuge for the American woman, offering guaranteed status and security in exchange for her fertility. But here is the detail that truly matters. The Shaker community used labor and ritual as psychological replacements for intimacy. Their world was defined by radical simplicity and absolute order. Their homes and furnishings, famous for their stark, beautiful symmetry, were a physical manifestation of their spiritual control. Everything had its place. Nothing was wasted. This obsessive focus on perfection was a deliberate, total countermeasure against the chaotic desires of the human heart. If your mind is consumed by the minute details of daily, regimented labor, it has no time for dangerous thought or forbidden desire. Pause and consider this image. A simple Shaker chair, its lines perfect and cold. The sound is only the gentle scrubbing of a floor, but the Shakers needed a release valve. Total suppression of natural human energy is psychologically impossible. Their solution was the terrifying rhythmic public ritual known as holy dancing. In their gatherings, the suppression of weeks, months, or years would explode. They would shout, whirl, shake, speak in strange tongues, and dance until they collapsed from exhaustion. A communal, rhythmic frenzy that earned them the nickname Shaking Quakers. This holy dancing served a crucial purpose. It was a pattern interrupt for the soul. The energy that would normally be directed toward procreation, family, or rebellion was discharged in a group setting, witnessed by the elders, and immediately re-sanctified as divine worship. The exhaustion that followed was interpreted as spiritual purity. The cult had successfully channeled the most potent force in human nature, sexuality, into a safe, controllable, and communal ritual. It was psychological mastery through total physiological manipulation. The problem, of course, was their future. Since they produced no children, they had to constantly recruit. Their greatest source of membership came from orphans and poor families who would deed their children to the community for care, often in exchange for payment. These children, raised from infancy without knowledge of the outside world or the existence of normal family units, were the perfect blank slate for the Shaker ideology. This practice reveals the dark core of the Shaker enigma. Their longevity was not a miracle of faith. It was an institutional triumph of indoctrination. They were a psychological machine designed to strip away the outside world and replace it with an utterly self-contained, meticulously managed reality. The celibacy was a feature, not a bug. It ensured that the only deep, lasting loyalty a person felt was not to a spouse or a child, but to the Shaker order itself. The community was the ultimate jealous and demanding parent. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Records from former Shaker communities show consistent, systematic efforts to discourage any affectionate or familial bonds between members, even between adopted siblings. Any display of natural affection was seen as a threat to the community's absolute control. The Shakers built beautiful buildings, but they constructed a prison for the heart, using the power of communalism to enforce a terrifying isolation of the soul. The system was designed to ensure that the individual had nowhere to turn except to the hierarchy. The true dread of the Shakers lies not in their strange dances, but in their corporate longevity. They perfected the cult as a business model, creating an economic fortress that survived the death of their founder, Mother Ann, and the inevitable disappointments of prophecy. Their survival was based on two things: quality control and secrecy. The Shakers were among the most successful entrepreneurs of the 19th century. They invented the circular saw, flat brooms, the screw propeller, and they were brilliant marketers of seeds and furniture. This economic success was once again a tool of control. Since the community owned everything collectively, their material prosperity was the only evidence that the system was divinely ordained. Prosperity equals purity. The outside world, chaotic and prone to financial panic, was constantly reminded that the Shaker way was demonstrably superior and stable. The American anxiety about corporate greed is deeply resonant here. The Shakers were a religious conglomerate, using the cloak of celibacy and holiness to build a massive, profitable real estate and manufacturing empire entirely tax-free, thanks to the very religious liberty that protected them. This is the ultimate conspiracy, the total fusion of spiritual mandate and corporate control. But here is the detail that truly matters. Their obsession with perfection in manufacturing, the smooth wood, the clean lines, the durability, was a reflection of their demand for perfection in the human soul. Every fault in a shaker-made chair was a sign of a fault in the spiritual life of the maker. The product became a terrifying moral report card. This high standard, while creating enduring objects, placed an unbearable psychological weight on the members, driving them deeper into submission to avoid the shame of imperfection. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The greatest internal threat to the shaker system was not outside interference, but the adolescent male. As the adopted boys came of age, they often struggled against the imposition of celibacy and the absence of any normal social outlet. Historical records detail the systematic methods of shaming and psychological manipulation used by the elders to coerce these young men into compliance, ranging from public confessions to outright expulsion, forcing them into the outside world they had been taught was hellish. This high retention system often had a high rejection rate for those who sought natural human connection. This era of strict celibacy was periodically interrupted by another strange psychological phenomenon: the era of manifestations. When the psychological pressure of suppression grew too great, the spirits would return. Young girls would fall into trances, claiming direct communication with the dead. They would receive instructions from spirit guides, often Native American chiefs or famous historical figures, who commanded new, often bizarre rituals and songs. This spiritual frenzy was not a sign of the elders losing control. It was a controlled eruption of repressed emotion. The spirits demanded attention, allowed members to momentarily break the rules of silence and order, and then vanished, leaving the members emotionally exhausted and thankful that the divine energy had been channeled by the leadership. The cult once again used manufactured chaos to restore control. The paradox of the shaker enigma ultimately rests on the fragility of the human mind. They proved that you could build a functioning, prosperous society that defied the biological imperative, so long as you replaced natural human bonds with economic dependence, psychological suppression, and total institutional loyalty. Their longevity was a horrifying testament to the power of a perfectly designed psychological prison. The year is 1844. The spiritual chaos of the burned-over district has reached its violent climax. The founding prophet of the largest American-born faith is dead, assassinated by a mob in Illinois. His followers, now numbering in the tens of thousands, are traumatized, persecuted, and stateless. This moment of crisis should have caused the movement to collapse. Instead, it gave birth to its most ruthless, successful, and terrifying leader, Brigham Young. Young was not a visionary in the mold of the original prophet. He was an architect of survival and a master of political absolutism. His genius lay in understanding that the faithful, having endured so much violence, no longer craved tolerance, they craved sovereignty. They wanted a land where the prophet was the only law, and they were willing to march into the literal wilderness to achieve it. The narrative shifts from religious experimentation to political and psychological warfare. The core of the new doctrine, revealed in secret and enforced with absolute authority, was plural marriage or polygamy. This was not a side issue. It was the engine of their social and economic control. But here is the detail that truly matters. Polygamy served a crucial, non-spiritual purpose. It ensured that wealth and power were consolidated at the very top of the hierarchy. The most senior leaders, like Brigham Young, married dozens of women, effectively controlling the most fertile population and concentrating vast family networks and resources under their direct command. For the ordinary, loyal man, marrying 2 or 3 wives ensured his commitment to the group. He was now a permanent outlaw in the eyes of the U.S. government, with nowhere else to go. Polygamy was the ultimate retention tool, simultaneously fulfilling a divine mandate and ensuring permanent social secession. Pause and consider this image. A stern portrait of Brigham Young, his eyes unblinking, juxtaposed against the vast, empty expanse of the Utah desert. The sound is the relentless creaking of wagon wheels. In 1847, the Great Exodus began, a forced march of thousands across the plains into a territory so desolate and forbidding that the U.S. government believed no one could survive there. They were seeking not just an empty space but a psychological sanctuary. Every mile traveled reinforced the siege mentality, the belief that the world outside was actively trying to destroy them. This paranoid narrative justified every subsequent act of isolation and control. When the first wagons reached the barren salt flats of the Great Basin, Brigham Young declared, "This is the place." It was a place of absolute control because survival depended entirely on unquestioning obedience to his civil and religious commands. He became the ultimate monarch, the sole dispenser of divine knowledge, land, water rights, and marital approval. He was the CEO of Zion, managing the material and spiritual fate of every soul. The psychological pressure inside this new kingdom was immense. The followers had traded the chaos of American freedom for the rigid certainty of a totalitarian theocracy. In this system, every citizen was a believer and every business was a church asset. Doubt was a threat to the harvest. Questioning the prophet was questioning the lifeblood of the community. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Newspaper reports from the time, sent back east by non-member traders, described a society utterly unlike anything else in America. A place where women lived in a complex, often emotionally devastating system of shared husbands, and where men's status was measured by the size of their marital holdings. These reports fueled the American public's paranoia about secret societies and anti-democratic plots brewing in the Western wilderness. This fear, this historical mystery of what truly went on behind the Wasatch Mountains, kept the nation fixated, ensuring the movement was constantly viewed as a dark, alluring conspiracy. This dread, fueled by sensationalized reports of government betrayal and secret laws, kept the lore-slumber audience utterly hooked. The rise of this polygamous dynasty was secured not just by faith, but by ruthless organizational structure and a profound understanding of economic coercion. Brigham Young established a system where the church controlled all commerce, industry, and resources in the territory. This was corporate greed sanctified by revelation. If you were a tradesman, the prophet was your only customer. If you were a farmer, the prophet controlled your water rights. If you were a believer, he controlled your eternal salvation. The integration was total. The economic system was the spiritual system. This meant that loyalty was non-negotiable. Defection meant not just damnation but instantaneous financial ruin and destitution in the middle of a desert. But here is the detail that truly matters. The system was designed to leverage the fundamental American ideal of hard work against the individual. Followers worked tirelessly to build roads, temples, and irrigation systems, believing they were building Zion. But every ounce of surplus labor flowed directly to the central, unchallenged authority. The community's immense shared labor created a powerful self-sustaining engine of control, ensuring that the collective efforts of the faithful only deepened the prophet's personal dominion. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The most chilling records from this period detail the systematic handling of dissent. Anyone who spoke against Brigham Young or the principle of polygamy was publicly shamed, threatened, and often driven from the community by force. When they fled, they had nothing. The prophet's power was so absolute that it sanctioned the creation of shadowy paramilitary groups dedicated to the purging of internal enemies and the execution of those deemed apostates. This is the point where the fear shifts from abstract theological anxiety to the fragility of the human mind under the threat of organized violence. The U.S. government finally intervened in 1857, sending the military in what became known as the Utah War, an unprecedented clash between federal authority and a powerful autonomous theocracy. The ultimate cause of the war was not the faith itself, but the absolute sovereignty the kingdom claimed, a challenge to the American legal system that could not be ignored. Brigham Young, ever the master strategist, used the invasion to complete the psychological conditioning of his people. The arrival of the U.S. Army was presented as the fulfillment of their darkest prophecies, the final, undeniable proof that the outside world was hell-bent on their destruction. This moment cemented their identity as a persecuted, chosen people, and reinforced the necessity of absolute obedience to their leader during the time of siege. The paranoia had been validated. The loyalty became unbreakable. The legacy of the kingdom in the West is that it proved you can build a large, enduring, and radical society entirely based on systematic isolation and psychological coercion, so long as you find a place where the state is too weak or too reluctant to intervene. It transformed the American dream of religious freedom into the dark reality of theocratic tyranny, backed by economic might, and the fear of abandonment in the wilderness. We have examined the ecstatic chaos of the burned-over district and the martial sovereignty of the Western Kingdom. Now we turn to a different model of psychological control, one built on bureaucratic rigidity and the quiet horror of perfection. This is the story of the Harmonists, or the Harmony Society, a German pietistic group led by the fiercely enigmatic George Rapp. In 1803, Rapp led a group of devoted followers from the spiritual stagnation of Europe to the sprawling, uncertain freedom of America. They settled in western Pennsylvania, a place of isolation, and began building their paradise. Their goal was not merely to practice their faith, but to reconstruct the very fabric of society in preparation for the imminent second coming of Christ. This was not a slow spiritual journey. It was a race against the end times. The central psychological mandate of the Harmonists was total communalism. Every member signed a document transferring all their wealth, property, and future earnings to the society, which was controlled absolutely by Father Rapp and his inner council. The reason for this transfer was brutally simple. The pursuit of individual wealth was the chief obstacle to spiritual purity. By eliminating private property, Rapp eliminated personal ambition, private dissent, and the psychological concept of a separate self. But here is the detail that truly matters. The Harmonists took this communalism to a chilling extreme. They were masters of industrial efficiency. They built successful factories, mills, and vineyards, creating astonishing wealth that fueled the society's expansion. The work itself was the worship. Rapp understood that keeping the community perpetually, exhaustively busy was the most effective method of psychological policing. Exhaustion eliminates dissent. When your body is physically drained from 12 hours of labor, your mind lacks the energy for dangerous thoughts like doubt or rebellion. Pause and consider this image. A massive, organized Harmonist woolen mill, the machinery clanking rhythmically, but the faces of the workers are utterly emotionless. The sound is the relentless drone of industry. The society's greatest tool of control, however, was not work. It was celibacy. Like the Shakers, the Harmonists mandated absolute abstinence. But while the Shakers used it to purify the spirit, Rapp used it to secure institutional stability. Children are the ultimate variable. They carry genetic loyalty, introduce new personalities, and most importantly, create financial distractions. By eliminating procreation, Rapp ensured that all emotional energy and future financial resources were directed solely back to Father Rapp and the society. The cult created a terrifyingly efficient system where longevity was prioritized over humanity. Members were not allowed to marry or have children, yet the society continually recruited new families. When those families had children, they were swiftly separated from their parents, integrated into the communal education system, and raised with primary loyalty to the institutional father, George Rapp, not their biological parents. This practice, the severing of the primary family bond, is the classic hallmark of total psychological control. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Archival contracts reveal clauses where members who chose to leave were only entitled to a tiny predefined sum, a sum far too small to survive on in the American wilderness. This economic coercion was the ultimate insurance policy. Freedom was technically available, but the price of exiting was immediate, guaranteed destitution. The American promise of independence became the harmonist trap. They were free to go, but they were not free to survive on their own. The society functioned as a gilded cage, and the members, realizing their dependence, willingly submitted to the rigid schedule, the communal shame, and the unrelenting labor, believing that only within Rapp's perfect order could they find security from the chaotic world outside. The true mystery of the harmonists lies in their financial success and the chilling patience of their founder. They moved their entire community twice, building 2 successful towns, first Harmony, Pennsylvania, and then New Harmony, Indiana, before finally returning to Pennsylvania to found their lasting home, Economy, later Ambridge. Each move was a massive undertaking, but it served to reinforce Rapp's absolute authority. It proved he could dismantle their world and build a better one, cementing the idea that Rapp's vision was infallible. Father Rapp did not merely control their lives. He manipulated their eschatology, their belief in the end times. He continually reinforced the imminence of Christ's return, urging his followers to be perfect now because the final judgment was at hand. This constant, low-level fear of the deadline created an emotional urgency that crushed any long-term planning or questioning. Why question the rule of celibacy when the trumpet could sound tomorrow? But here is the detail that truly matters. As the years passed and the second coming failed to materialize, Rapp, now an old man, introduced a new, terrifying layer of control: the doctrine of transferable holiness. He taught that the community's collective spiritual purity was a tangible asset, an asset that he, the prophet CEO, could manage and vouch for. If you doubted or defected, you were not just losing your soul, you were potentially damaging the collective purity that was securing salvation for everyone else. This placed the entire psychological burden of the community's failure onto the shoulders of the individual dissenter. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The most significant external threat to the harmonists came in 1832 with the arrival of a self-proclaimed messiah named Bernhard Müller, or Count Leon. Leon managed to seduce dozens of harmonists, including Rapp's own adopted son, with promises of a richer, more immediate spiritual life. Rapp's response was swift and brutal. He paid Leon a massive sum, over $100,000, to take the dissenters and leave, forcing the defectors to sign away any further claims. This event exposed the raw truth. The purity of the community was guarded not by faith but by corporate resources. Rapp was willing to pay a fortune to keep the psychological integrity of his system intact, proving that corporate greed was the ultimate defense mechanism of this religious experiment. This act created an enduring legacy of fear. For the remaining members, the message was clear: dissent is expensive, and it will be bought out and then forgotten. You cannot escape without paying the ultimate price of isolation and poverty. Rapp died in 1847 without ever seeing the return of Christ, but his system of celibate perfection and economic rigor had succeeded. The society's wealth continued to grow, even as its membership dwindled down the decades, having eliminated its own future. The ultimate horror of the harmonists is the physical evidence they left behind: perfectly preserved towns, filled with beautiful, meticulously crafted objects, but utterly devoid of the sound of children or the warmth of normal family life. A vast, prosperous monument to total emotional and spiritual sterilization. The lure of perfection, the promise of a stable utopia free from the financial and moral chaos of America, proved to be the ultimate psychological hook. But the cost was the human soul, surrendered entirely to the demands of a prophet who turned a spiritual quest into a medieval-style corporate absolute monarchy. We have spent 5 chapters examining the products of American cultism: the communal empires, the polygamous kingdoms, the silent utopias. Now, we must turn our focus to the engine of this madness, the single human mind at the center of the storm. The cult leader is not merely a confused preacher. He is a specific psychological entity, an architect of deceit, whose methods are as ancient as they are terrifyingly effective. The true hallmark of the cult leader is not conviction. It is unfettered, pathological narcissism, cloaked in the language of humility and revelation. These figures, from Ann Lee to Joseph Smith to George Rapp, all shared a defining trait: a profound, unquestionable belief in their own ultimate importance. They did not believe they spoke for God. They believed they were the literal final vessel of the divine. This immense ego served a critical function. It created the infallibility shield. Once a leader declares himself the literal manifestation of truth, all rules of logic, consistency, and morality cease to apply to him. He can demand celibacy for his followers while practicing polygamy himself. He can preach poverty while controlling a corporate empire. Any contradiction is immediately redefined as a higher truth, available only to the chosen prophet. But here's the detail that truly matters. The cult leader's narrative is always one of unjust persecution. He presents himself as the victim of the corrupt outside world, the government, the media, the established church. This narrative does 2 things. It distracts the followers from the leader's own flaws, and it transforms the community's isolation from a consequence of their extreme behavior into a badge of honor. You are not a cult. You are the chosen few being tested by a wicked world. This psychological mechanism solidifies the conspiracy theory that justifies all subsequent paranoia. Pause and consider this image. A black and white, slightly grainy, photograph of a charismatic man gesturing wildly, juxtaposed with text describing financial fraud. The sound is a low, ominous rumble. The second core trait is the mastery of the revelation cycle. A traditional leader is bound by scripture. The cult leader is not. Whenever a crisis arose, financial, political, or sexual, the leader would experience a new revelation, instantly overriding previous doctrine or addressing the immediate threat. This pattern interrupt kept the followers perpetually off balance, unable to rely on established scripture or internal consistency. Their minds were conditioned to wait for the next unpredictable command from the top, ensuring total, moment-to-moment psychological dependence. This technique is medieval in its simplicity. The leader becomes the living oracle, and the followers are reduced to mere scribes and executors of his constantly shifting divine will. This process erodes the follower's executive function, the capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. The leader's voice, whether smooth and authoritative like Brigham Young's or ecstatic and frenzied like the earlier revivalists, is designed to weaponize fragility and fear. He finds the core anxiety of the American audience: economic collapse, moral decay, political betrayal, and offers a total inoculation against it, provided they surrender their critical faculties. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The most consistent pattern found in the documentation of early American cults is the leader's rapid escalation of demands. It always begins with a mild spiritual commitment, then escalates to demands for money, then property, then labor, then total control over sex and family life. This is the slow-motion psychological betrayal. The follower is constantly giving more and more, and because the price of leaving becomes too high, the loss of everything they surrendered, they are compelled to continue, convincing themselves that their final sacrifice will be the one that finally earns salvation. The leader is a master salesman of sunk costs, and the followers are his trapped investors. The cult leader's manipulation is not limited to his followers' minds. It extends to the construction of their physical and social world. The final, most crucial hallmark is the creation of the total institution, the gilded cage that psychologically seals the deal. The physical structure of the cult, whether a communal mansion like Oneida or a massive Western territory, is designed to eliminate all external points of reference. There is no television, no non-approved books, no unmonitored letters, and above all, no unapproved conversations. The leader ensures that the only facts available to the followers are the ones that originate from him. This is the true power of historical mystery. The controlled environment makes it impossible for the members to verify any historical or even contemporary truth. But here's the detail that truly matters. The leader establishes a system of horizontal policing. He recruits a small inner circle of trusted, highly devoted followers who are granted special privileges, often sexual or financial, in exchange for absolute loyalty. This inner circle then surveils and reports on the general membership. This decentralization of paranoia is the genius of the cult structure. The followers are not just afraid of the prophet, they are afraid of each other. Pause and consider this image. A narrow hallway in an old communal building. The scene is empty, but the feeling is one of being watched from every doorway. The sound is a barely audible, repetitive whisper. This system of internal surveillance and mutual criticism, perfected by groups like the Oneida community, is a powerful technique for dissolving individual identity. When you know your every doubt, every stray thought, must be confessed to a committee of your peers, you quickly learn to self-censor. You stop having the unacceptable thought entirely. The leader has successfully outsourced his authoritarianism, forcing the follower to become their own most ruthless psychological jailer. The ultimate control mechanism is the leader's ability to manipulate intimacy. By controlling marriage, polygamy, or abolishing it, celibacy, the leader ensures that the most potent emotional bond, the nuclear family, is either shattered or redirected. The leader replaces the spouse as the ultimate emotional anchor. Your deepest relationships, your most intense vulnerabilities, are now owned by the system. This level of intimate betrayal is what makes the cult recovery process so difficult and traumatic. The American cult leader, therefore, is not a failure of American liberty. He is a dark, perverse mirror of its deepest fears. He is the ultimate corporate mogul, creating a tax-exempt empire from the unpaid labor of his followers. He is the ultimate conspiracy theorist, using the rhetoric of government betrayal to justify his absolute rule, and he is the ultimate psychologist, using the promise of certainty to prey on the fragile human mind. The serpent in Eden is simply a man who has perfected the art of convincing others that their freedom is the cause of their pain, and only his gilded cage can provide true sanctuary. We now execute a psychological reverse engineering. We are looking not at the rules of the cult, but at the mind of the founder and the sheer force of will required to declare oneself God incarnate. The perfect case study is Mother Ann Lee, the illiterate English factory worker who founded the Shakers. Her legacy is the terrifying blueprint for the cult of personality, a system where the doctrine is the leader, and the leader is the absolute law. Ann Lee's personal history was defined by trauma. She endured the agonizing loss of all four of her children in infancy and suffered a turbulent, unhappy marriage. The chaos of her personal life was channeled into a singular, devastating religious conclusion. Sex and the family unit were the roots of all human misery. Her divine claim was birthed from her personal wounds. This is the first critical step of the cult of personality. The leader transforms their private pain into public universal doctrine. She was not a gentle, passive figure. Ann Lee was a force of nature, known for her intense charisma, her ecstatic trances, and her fierce public denunciations of sin. She claimed direct, constant dialogue with God, not through ancient texts, but through immediate, fresh revelation. This was the psychological masterstroke. She eliminated the Bible as the final authority and replaced it with her own living voice. When she spoke, the followers believed they were hearing the literal, unfiltered word of God. But here is the detail that truly matters. Ann Lee defined her authority through gender. She declared herself the female aspect of God's dual nature, the second coming of Christ in the female form. This resonated powerfully with women in the 18th century who were denied authority, property rights, and spiritual leadership by every established church. She offered them a radical new status, spiritual equality and freedom from the constant threat of pregnancy and poverty. This promise of status in exchange for absolute submission is the core psychological transaction of the Shaker cult of personality. Pause and consider this image. An 18th century sketch of Mother Ann Lee, her face hardened by conviction, surrounded by followers in ecstatic trance. The sound is a faint, rhythmic humming. Her early life in England was marked by persecution and imprisonment. When she led her tiny group to America in 1774, this history of suffering was immediately reframed as proof of her divine mission. The persecution became her prophetic resume. Her followers believed that the chaotic world, hostile to their small group, was simply validating the truth of her radical message. This mechanism, using external hostility to reinforce internal loyalty, is a tactic used by every successful cult leader to this day. Ann Lee established herself as the ultimate, unquestionable parent. By mandating celibacy, she shattered the traditional family structure and replaced the biological mother and father with the cult mother and the elder brother. This institutionalized family replacement ensured that every member's deepest emotional, psychological, and material dependency was directed toward the hierarchy she created. This is the medieval style of control brought to America. The prophet is the feudal lord of the soul, owning not just the land, but the family bonds themselves. Her authority was secured not by literacy or traditional learning, but by sheer emotional intensity. She used the ecstatic spiritual state, the holy dancing, to overwhelm the critical faculties of her followers. In a state of trance, shouting and spinning until exhaustion, the followers could not logically analyze her doctrine. They could only feel the truth of her presence. This is emotional coercion at its most fundamental, overriding rationality with overwhelming, shared physiological experience. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Records from former Shaker communities detail the immense psychological pressure to confess sins publicly to the elders. This process, known as confession, was not for spiritual absolution. It was a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. The leadership knew the secrets, the weaknesses, and the doubts of every single member. This total knowledge allowed them to preemptively crush dissent, punish emotional attachments, and ensure that every action, every whisper, remained under the shadow of the central authority. The ultimate legacy of Mother Anne's absolute control. The ultimate test of a cult of personality is not its success during the founder's lifetime, but its survival after their death. When Mother Anne Lee died in 1784, her physical presence was gone, but her absolute authority had to remain. This challenge forced her followers to perform a profound act of psychological and institutional engineering. They did not replace Mother Anne. They transformed her into an infallible ghost. They established a complex governance system known as the ministry, a dual leadership of elder brothers and elder sisters, whose sole purpose was to interpret, execute, and perpetuate Anne's original, unwritten mandates. The paradox was this: the new leaders had to rule with absolute authority, while simultaneously claiming they were merely the humble servants of a dead prophet. But here is the detail that truly matters. The system they built, the millennial laws, were not flexible guidelines. They were minute, exhaustive rules governing every detail of life, from how clothes were folded to the prescribed distance between beds. These laws, though enforced by the new ministry, were presented as the tangible will of Mother Anne herself. By hyper-regulating the physical environment, they successfully maintained the psychological environment of total control established by the founder. The personality was gone, but the absolute authority was codified into furniture, floorboards, and silence. Pause and consider this image. A list of meticulously handwritten millennial laws, detailing mundane rules, yet illuminated with a chilling, artificial perfection. The sound is a sharp, sudden clap or snap. This succession reveals the dark genius of Anne Lee's legacy. She created a system that did not rely on her brilliance, but on the followers' absolute need for certainty. Her death was a pattern interrupt that terrified them, and the ministry's rigid absolute laws offered immediate comforting stability in the void. They were psychologically compelled to cling to the new rules as proof that the system was immortal, even if the founder was not. The cult of personality was now entirely detached from the actual person. The corporate efficiency and economic success that followed, as discussed in the Shaker Enigma segment, were not just a byproduct of their labor. They were the material proof that Mother Anne's ghost was still blessing the venture. Prosperity became the final, undeniable propaganda that guaranteed retention. The Shakers endured through centuries by successfully perpetuating a truth that was demonstrably false: that the will of their long-dead founder was the only force driving their existence. They proved that a sufficiently powerful, trauma-based cult of personality can transcend mortality, so long as the leadership is willing to enforce absolute control over the financial, social, and emotional lives of the members. The individual person vanishes. The tyrannical system remains. The ultimate conspiracy here is the perfect fusion of the spiritual and the bureaucratic. We now dissect the most insidious form of cult control: the complete fusion of faith and finance. This is the cult of the purse, where the ultimate promise of salvation is bought, where corporate greed is redefined as divine mandate, and where the member is psychologically coerced into funding their own gilded prison. This system weaponizes the core American anxieties about wealth, debt, and economic instability. The foundation of financial exploitation in a cult is the principle of sacrificial giving. The leader establishes a zero-sum reality. The more you keep for yourself, the less holy you are. The more you give to the collective, i.e. the leader, the more merit you accrue for the afterlife. This is a brilliant psychological maneuver that turns poverty into virtue and personal savings into spiritual vice. The initial demand is often couched in benign terms, a voluntary donation or a tithe. But the emotional escalation begins the moment the leader introduces the emergency revelation. This is a sudden, urgent prophecy. The world is about to end. The government is about to attack, or a divine project requires immediate funding. This pattern interrupt overrides the member's rational assessment of their personal finances, demanding the surrender of the last reserve of personal security. But here is the detail that truly matters. Once the member has surrendered their entire material life, their land, their savings, their home, the leader has achieved total control. The member is now utterly dependent on the group for survival. They cannot leave, not because of belief, but because of destitution. Faith is merely the philosophical justification for a state of economic slavery. This is the medieval-style vassalage repackaged for the modern era, where the prophet acts as the feudal lord of all assets. Pause and consider this image. A faded ledger book, the numbers meticulously recorded, showing the transfer of a lifetime of savings to a religious trust. The sound is the slow, deliberate counting of coins. The psychological coercion is reinforced through the doctrine of divine prosperity. The cult leader often preaches a message that appeals directly to the American desire for wealth. God wants you to be rich, but only through the profit system. Your financial sacrifice today is merely an investment that will be repaid 100-fold, either in the afterlife or in the imminent earthly kingdom they are building. This is the ultimate historical mystery for the member. They are perpetually chasing the promised material payoff that never arrives, continually pouring money into a failing investment to save the initial investment. We see this most clearly in the development of cults as corporate conglomerates. Groups like the Harmonists and the later movements in the West did not just collect money. They created massive, successful businesses. But the businesses served a dual purpose: to generate wealth for the hierarchy and to act as a permanent, controlled employer for the members. This total integration eliminates the outside labor market as a place of refuge. Your job, your community, your salvation, and your bank account are all controlled by the same singular authority. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The most chilling financial documents are the quitclaim deeds and release forms members were forced to sign upon entering the community, often forfeiting all rights to restitution upon leaving. These are contracts of psychological and economic betrayal, showing a clear, premeditated intent to strip the follower of legal leverage. The religious freedom that protected the cult's property rights became the trap that guaranteed the members' permanent servitude. The modern corporation, cloaked in holiness, became the perfect engine of corporate greed. The ultimate success of the cult of the purse relies on a principle called the sunk cost fallacy. Once a member has given away their house, their inheritance, and 10 years of free labor, the psychological pressure to remain becomes almost insurmountable. To leave means accepting not just that the faith was wrong, but that their entire life's effort was a mistake, and that they are now broke and alone. The cognitive dissonance is too painful to bear. The leader capitalizes on this psychological pain by introducing the scapegoat. When the promised prosperity fails to appear, when the communal treasury dips or the prophecies fail, the blame is never placed on the prophet. It is placed on the lack of faith or the insufficient sacrifice of the members. This is the final intimate betrayal. The member is forced to believe that they are the problem, compelling them to try harder, give more, and work longer to prove their loyalty. But here is the detail that truly matters. The leader often utilizes tiered financial structures to control different segments of the American audience. For the wealthy, the demand is total, immediate surrender of assets. For the poor, the demand is total unpaid labor. Both are stripped of their economic freedom, but the labor cults create a sense of manufactured value for the disenfranchised. They offer the dignity of purpose and the illusion of ownership over the things they create. Even though the profits flow exclusively to the top, this is the illusion of a self-sustaining system, a terrifying fantasy of shared effort with unequal reward. Pause and consider this image. A massive, imposing temple or headquarters built entirely through the uncompensated labor of the membership. The structure is majestic, but the light is cold. The emotional escalation peaks when the leader demands financial sacrifice in the face of direct external threat. Whether it is the U.S. government suing for unpaid taxes or a former member initiating a lawsuit, the leader frames the legal defense as a spiritual battle. The members are required to fund the legal war against the outside world, effectively paying for the lawyers who shield their exploiter. This is the moment where government betrayal becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The state's attempt to restore justice is used as a fundraising tool for the cult. The psychological consequence of the cult of the purse is a complete inversion of American values. The freedom to acquire wealth is replaced by the duty to surrender it. The individual pursuit of happiness is replaced by the collective pursuit of the prophet's corporate agenda. The members live in a state of perpetual economic dread and spiritual competition, constantly measuring their loyalty by the size of their financial sacrifice. The American cult leader, more than any other figure, understood that the surest way to own a man's soul was to first own his wallet. By successfully merging the language of salvation with the demands of corporate accounting, they created a self-sustaining, self-justifying financial engine that trapped generation after generation. We have charted the cults of wealth, isolation, and personality. Now we must examine the deepest psychological hook of all, the weaponization of identity and the cruel exploitation of social disenfranchisement. For millions in American history, particularly those subjected to systemic oppression, the cult offered a radical, total reversal of their earthly suffering, a cosmic elevation that transformed them from victims of history into its divine architects. The central crisis for marginalized groups in America, whether racial, economic, or immigrant, is the constant denial of status. Mainstream society tells them they are less than. The cult leader steps into this void and declares the opposite. You are the chosen people. Your suffering is your anointment. The world that rejects you is soon to be destroyed by the God who cherishes you. This narrative, preached across various movements, is the theology of vindication. It transforms historical injustice into spiritual destiny. But here is the detail that truly matters. The most successful cult leaders targeting these groups did not promise integration into American society. They promised dominion over it. They often crafted new racial histories through revelation, declaring their followers to be the true descendants of biblical figures or ancient royalty, while redefining the dominant groups as spiritually flawed, doomed, or even demonic. This is psychological warfare used to elevate the follower's self-worth. You are no longer a victim. You are a secret king waiting for your throne. Pause and consider this image. A 1930s-era photograph of a small, dignified group of people in robes or uniforms, their expressions fierce with conviction. The sound is a triumphant yet slightly dissonant choir. This appeal was often economic as well as spiritual. For those trapped in cycles of poverty and corporate greed, particularly in urban centers after the Great Migration, the cult offered a tangible, self-contained economic fortress. They established their own cooperative grocery stores, banks, and businesses. Joining the cult meant more than finding God. It meant finding a job, a credit line, and a community that did not judge you based on the color of your skin or your lack of savings. The cult became a complete, necessary replacement for the American economic system that had failed them. The leader's authority was rooted in their ability to speak a language of uncompromising pride and absolute certainty. Where established religious leaders preached patience and gradual change, the cult leader preached immediate, radical upheaval. The American anxiety over government betrayal was easily weaponized. The government had historically failed and betrayed these communities. Therefore, the only logical conclusion was to place trust entirely in the new, separate, and divinely sanctioned authority. The core psychological transaction here is the trade of freedom for identity. The cost of this guaranteed elevated identity, the status of the chosen, is absolute obedience. The member is no longer allowed to question the leader's financial decisions, sexual demands, or political mandates, because the moment they question the prophet, they are questioning the very divine status that lifted them out of their earthly misery. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Historical police and legal records from the Sayyidai 1920s and 30s show a common pattern. The first external conflict was often not over the doctrine, but over land and property. When the cult established physical headquarters and began accumulating urban real estate or farmland, it threatened the existing economic power structure. This opposition, whether legal or violent, was instantly used by the leader as proof of the conspiracy, cementing the followers' belief that the outside world truly was demonic and dedicated to their destruction. The historical mystery of the outside world's intent was solved with one terrifying word: betrayal. The cult of identity relies on a powerful medieval-style technique, the reclassification of time and space. The leader teaches his followers to live not in the flawed present, but in the imminent glorious future he has prophesied. Every sacrifice made today, every dollar given, every relative shunned, is merely a small investment in a spectacular guaranteed destiny. The leader perfects the art of creating customized sacred geography. The cult's headquarters, whether a simple rented storefront or a sprawling compound, is defined as the literal holiest place on earth, the final temple of the sun, the last sanctuary before the storm. This geographical isolation, whether physical or social, ensures that the member's reality is entirely constructed within the cult's walls. The leader controls the map, and therefore, he controls the ultimate destination. But here is the detail that truly matters. The most devastating tactic in this process is the mandatory rejection of the previous life. To fully accept the new divine identity, the member must cut ties with any unbelieving family, friends, or institutions. This social sterilization is the key to maintaining retention. Once the follower has severed their support networks, they are left with only one choice: the cult. Their fragility of the human mind is utterly exposed, and the cult becomes the sole source of emotional sustenance, economic security, and physical protection. Pause and consider this image: a discarded family photograph lying on a dirt floor. The edges are curled and fading. The sound is the scratch of a record player, repeating a soothing yet monotonous hymn. The ultimate aim of the leader is to turn a marginalized group into a private army, ready for action. The leader instills a sense of cosmic urgency, the belief that they alone are responsible for ushering in the prophesied new world. This responsibility gives the member a sense of ultimate purpose that was denied to them by mainstream society. They are no longer just factory workers or farmers. They are the soldiers of God, ready to execute the prophet's final command. This is where the psychological manipulation reaches its peak. The leader has successfully leveraged the pain of oppression into a total surrender of individual will. The collective pride and vindication they feel comes at the cost of their moral autonomy. They become capable of actions, violence, extreme sacrifice, mass defection, that they would have never considered as independent individuals, because their actions are now justified by their divine, manufactured destiny. The enduring tragedy of the cult of the marginalized is the exploitation of genuine pain. These cults offered a beautiful, powerful vision of racial dignity and spiritual purpose, only to use that hope as the anchor for personal tyranny and corporate exploitation. The greatest conspiracy is the simple, chilling equation: oppression plus profit, absolute control. We now dissect the ultimate psychological lever of the cult leader: eschatology, the study of the end of the world. The American soul is constantly haunted by the fear of collapse, economic, moral, or cosmic. The cult leader capitalizes on this ancient anxiety, transforming the ambiguous promise of the afterlife into an imminent, violent deadline. This is not faith. It is a strategic use of absolute dread to demand total, unthinking sacrifice. The core principle is the shortening horizon. A traditional religion places salvation far off, requiring a lifetime of moderate devotion. The cult leader collapses this timeline. He declares that the apocalypse is happening now. This immediate threat is the perfect pattern interrupt for the rational mind. When the world is ending next Tuesday, the urgency overrides all critical thought about money, property, or family. The most famous early example is the Millerite movement of the 1840s, where William Miller precisely calculated the date of Christ's return. The psychological fallout of this movement, the great disappointment, is more important than the calculation itself. Thousands of people sold their homes, quit their jobs, and gathered on hillsides, utterly convinced of the date. They were practicing preemptive psychological surrender. They surrendered their futures, their financial stability, and their social standing, proving that the fragility of the human mind is most exposed when facing annihilation. But here is the detail that truly matters. The failure of the prophecy did not destroy the loyalty. It intensified the paranoia. Instead of concluding the prophet was wrong, many followers concluded the calculation was right. But the event was spiritual and invisible. This psychological maneuver allowed them to cling to the original, intense commitment while simply shifting the goalposts. This is the cult of the sunk cost in its purest form. Having sacrificed everything for the end date, they were now compelled to find a new, more radical sect that could promise the real final answer. Pause and consider this image. An old lithograph of people dressed in white robes, looking toward a dark, empty sky. The sound is the chime of a clock counting down. The leader weaponizes the historical mystery of prophecy. He claims to have the secret key, the unique revelation that unlocks the precise meaning of biblical texts like Daniel or Revelation. By making the interpretation complex and exclusive, he ensures that the followers must rely entirely on him to navigate the approaching storm. This technical complexity is a deliberate fog of war, ensuring absolute obedience to the one man who claims to hold the map. The ultimate aim of eschatology is financial exploitation, and total asset transfer. The prophet declares that since money and property are meaningless in the face of annihilation, they must be handed over to the only entity that can save them, the cult. This demand for immediate total financial sacrifice is perfectly justified by the imminence of the end. Why worry about corporate greed when all corporations are about to burn? The cult leader exploits the deepest American fear, losing everything, by convincing them to lose it voluntarily. To him, the documents reveal a new kind of fear. Legal papers from the mid-19th century detail the immediate scramble of disillusioned followers after a failed prophecy, trying to reclaim deeds and assets transferred to the prophet's name. These papers show a calculated pattern. The prophet's financial structure was designed to be legally impervious to reclaim. The transfer was permanent, the sacrifice irreversible. The promise of salvation was merely the medieval-style rhetoric for a massive, unreturnable capital infusion. We look closer at the mechanism of coercion within the cult structure after the end has been declared. The impending deadline does not just loosen financial attachments. It shatters moral boundaries. When the final judgment is days away, all earthly law, human morality, civil statutes, and even common decency becomes irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the prophet's final command. This is the state of moral vacuum that the leader intentionally engineers. In this vacuum, the most terrifying acts can be commanded and justified as divine necessity. The follower's conscience is suspended. They are merely the executor of the apocalypse's terms and conditions. But here is the detail that truly matters. The leader uses the end times scenario to enforce absolute social isolation. He warns that the outside world, the family members, the government, the old friends, or the agents of the Antichrist, or the wicked and unbelieving. This justified government betrayal is the final step in ensuring retention. If the follower believes that leaving the cult means joining the forces that God is about to destroy, the psychological terror of defection becomes absolute. Pause and consider this image. A simple wooden gate, covered in barbed wire, with a crude sign warning of the world outside. The sound is a low, persistent static, like a dying radio transmission. The emotional escalation builds relentlessly on the promise of vindication. The end is not just punishment, it is the ultimate reward for the faithful. The follower who was marginalized, poor, or ridiculed in their past life is promised a front row seat to the destruction of their tormentors. This narrative of divine revenge is immensely satisfying to the oppressed mind, binding them to the leader who promises this final, glorious reversal of fortune. This is the ultimate medieval concept of a righteous war against the infidel, fought with prophecies instead of swords. The consequence of this extreme belief is the creation of the ultimate sacrifice cult. The members are conditioned to believe that they must be physically prepared for the end, often meaning they must move to a remote, self-contained compound like the later movements of the 20th century. This forced isolation is the spatial manifestation of the psychological collapse. The cult is the only lifeboat, and the leader is the only captain. The ultimate act of coercion comes when the leader uses the fragility of the human mind to demand mass suicide or mass confrontation. If the leader is cornered by the outside world, he can easily frame the situation as the final battle foretold in Scripture. The only faithful act left is to follow him into glorious collective death, which is merely the final step into the prophesied kingdom. The end times prophecy, which began as a tool for financial exploitation, culminates as a justification for mass trauma and death. The American cult leader proved that by manipulating the concept of time, he could negate all earthly morality and legal systems. The whispers of the apocalypse were not a forecast. They were the ultimatum that demanded the followers' final irreversible surrender. We have analyzed the prophet's mind, the financial traps, and the fear of the apocalypse. Now we confront the most fundamental tool of all cult systems: isolation. Isolation is not merely about finding a remote compound. It is the deliberate psychological construction of an exclusive reality bubble where the leader's word becomes the only verifiable truth. This process weaponizes the core American anxieties of historical mystery and conspiracy to ensure absolute permanent retention. The initial step in isolation is the information blackout. The cult leader systematically restricts access to any media, book, or external opinion that contradicts the official doctrine. This is intellectual sterilization. When the only news you hear is filtered through the prophet, your perception of the outside world, the one you left behind, becomes warped. It is consistently portrayed as a place of moral decay, imminent collapse, and government betrayal. But here is the detail that truly matters. The leader does not just eliminate information. He replaces it with an elaborate self-referential mythology. Every ritual, every prophecy, every shared hardship within the compound is meticulously crafted to give the member a feeling of superior knowledge. They are the few who know the real truth, while the rest of the world is comprised of the blind or the wicked. This manufactured status, the pride of being uniquely informed, is a powerful psychological reward that binds the follower to the group. Pause and consider this image. A television screen showing static, but a face is visible staring out from the noise. The sound is a low buzzing feedback. This isolation is enforced through linguistic separation. Cults often develop their own unique lexicon. Special terms, secret names, and codified phrases that are meaningless to outsiders. This in-group language serves a chilling purpose. It acts as a mental fence. When a member speaks, they are constantly using the group's terms, which reinforces their separate identity and makes it nearly impossible to articulate doubt or dissent using a neutral, shared language. To speak is to belong. The physical act of retreating to a compound, whether the Western settlements or the remote farmhouses of the Shakers, is the final, tangible expression of this control. This geographical isolation simplifies the surveillance problem. The leader becomes the only visible authority. There is no external police force, no competing employer, and no neutral neighbor to turn to. The entire landscape becomes a medieval-style fortress where the cult leader is the unchallenged king. The true dread, however, lies in the elimination of the family unit as a safe space. We have seen how polygamy, celibacy, and communal marriage all serve to shatter the primary loyalty bond. When children are raised in communal nurseries and spouses are shared or forbidden, the member's deepest emotional connection is forcibly rerouted to the abstract entity of the group. This social sterilization ensures that if a member attempts to leave, they are not just abandoning a religious belief, they are abandoning every single person they love and depend on. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Records from escapees and investigative reports show the constant use of monitored correspondence and confiscated mail. Letters arriving from family members in the outside world, filled with love, concern, or legitimate facts, were intercepted, edited, or never delivered. Any emotional breach in the wall was ruthlessly sealed. The leader presented this as protection from the contaminating influence of the wicked world. But it was, in fact, the calculated maintenance of the exclusive reality bubble. The wall of isolation is ultimately maintained not by the leader, but by the members themselves. The most advanced cults achieve isolation through horizontal policing, turning the followers into both victims and perpetrators of the isolation. This is achieved through the system of mandatory transparency. Whether it is the shaker practice of public confession or the Oneida practice of mutual criticism, the member is required to confess their doubts, negative thoughts, and emotional attachments to a council of their peers. This eliminates the private self. But here's the detail that truly matters. Once the member's deepest doubts are publicly exposed, they become the property of the group. The council, acting as the leader's proxy, uses this intimate knowledge to shame, humiliate, or restructure the member's behavior. The terror of being exposed compels the member to become their own most ruthless psychological jailer. They stop having the wrong thoughts because they fear the public humiliation that will follow. The fragility of the human mind is weaponized against the individual. Pause and consider this image. A single spotlight shining on an empty chair in a large silent room. The sound is a magnified human sigh. The leader utilizes love bombing and withdrawal to enforce compliance. When a member is performing perfectly, they are showered with praise, intimacy, and status. The moment they show doubt or question the doctrine, the love is immediately, totally withdrawn. They are shunned, isolated within the group, and treated as spiritually flawed. This emotional whiplash creates a powerful psychological dependency. The member learns that safety and love are contingent upon total, absolute obedience. Their fear of isolation from the group becomes greater than their desire for freedom outside it. The final, unbreakable layer of the wall of isolation is the creation of a common enemy that justifies all sacrifices. By framing the outside world as a massive conspiracy dedicated to the cult's destruction, whether it's the U.S. government, as in the Utah War, satanic forces, or corporate enemies, the leader provides the ultimate validation for their isolation. Every news report, every legal challenge, every military action is immediately interpreted as proof of the prophet's truth. The government betrayal is the cement that holds the wall together. The terrifying consequence of this complete isolation is the member's loss of the ability to verify reality. They no longer have the neutral social context necessary to judge whether the prophet is a genius or a madman, whether the outside world is hell or merely imperfect. They are left with only the exclusive reality of the cult, making defection not just a logistical challenge, but a complete psychological breakdown. To leave the cult means to willingly step out of a structured reality and into a terrifying, unfamiliar void. We have tracked the cults from their chaotic birth to their meticulously constructed walls of isolation. Now we must face the terrifying consequence of that isolation. The moment the utopian dream curdles into the internal nightmare. When the cult leader achieves absolute physical and psychological control, the absence of external law inevitably gives rise to absolute human cruelty. The key to this escalation is the elimination of accountability. In their isolated retreats, whether the distant homesteads of the harmonists, the compounds of polygamous factions, or the mansions of charismatic leaders, the leader is no longer beholden to courts, police, or public opinion. The community exists in a legal void, and in that void, the leader's personal pathology becomes the only law. But here is the detail that truly matters. The abuse is rarely random. It is systematic and doctrinal. The leader transforms physical and psychological punishment into spiritual necessity. Child abuse, sexual manipulation, and beatings are not seen as crimes but as purification rituals, a necessary weeding of the sinful elements to prepare the community for the impending end times. The terror of the apocalypse is replaced by the immediate physical terror of the prophet's rage. Pause and consider this image. A close-up on a heavy locked door, bolted from the outside. The sound is the faint muffled sound of a single sob. The first victims of this escalation are almost always the children. The cult system demands that a child's primary loyalty be to the prophet, not the parent. This means that if a child is disobedient or asks skeptical questions, the parent is coerced into participating in or condoning the abuse. This is a devastating psychological tactic. It forces the follower to betray their own flesh and blood in order to prove their absolute loyalty to the prophet. This act of familial betrayal breaks the last remaining independent moral compass the follower possesses. The dark retreat becomes a place where historical reality is utterly inverted. The promise of communal support becomes the threat of communal shame. We see this in the practice of ritualized public humiliation. In many historical cults, minor transgressions, a lapse in faith, a personal affection, a complaint, were met with public beatings, starvation, or forced confession sessions lasting days. This humiliation served as a pattern interrupt to the individual ego. It broke their sense of self-worth and rebuilt it, piece by painful piece, entirely dependent on the leader's approval. The internal economy of the compound also spirals into pure corporate exploitation. Followers, having surrendered all assets and believing they are building God's kingdom, are subjected to crushing labor, long hours, and minimal food. Any attempt to hoard resources or slacken work is met with punishment, justified as spiritual sloth. The beautiful utopian dream of corporate sharing dissolves into the brutal, medieval reality of forced servitude, enforced by religious terror. The leader, already rich from the initial asset transfer, becomes a tyrannical baron, squeezing the final drops of labor from his terrified vassals. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Testimonies from survivors of these historical retreats consistently detail the terror of arbitrary rules. The leader's dictates, what to eat, what to wear, whom to speak to, would change daily or even hourly. This constant unpredictability is a deliberate psychological weapon. It keeps the follower in a permanent state of anxiety and hypervigilance, ensuring they are too stressed and exhausted to plan an escape or form an independent thought. The only path to temporary safety is total, unthinking submission to the moment's command. The ultimate internal nightmare is realized when the leader's paranoia becomes contagious, infecting the entire compound. Isolation breeds paranoia, and the leader ensures that the members turn that paranoia inward. The terror of the dark retreat is the forced loss of intimacy and privacy. The most personal relationships, sexual, marital, or parental, are all controlled, monitored, and used as leverage. The leader's use of polygamy or communal sex is not about liberation. It is about depersonalization. It ensures that no single deep bond can rival the member's loyalty to the prophet. When sex is commanded, it is not an expression of love, but an act of ritualized obedience, further blurring the line between worship and exploitation. But here is the detail that truly matters. The leader's most destructive tactic is the creation of a shadow enemy within the compound, the concept of the internal apostate. By accusing a specific member or family of being spiritually contaminated, or secretly planning government betrayal, the leader justifies the most extreme, violent forms of abuse. This selective terror sends a chilling message to the remaining members. If you deviate, this will be your fate. Pause and consider this image. A blurred, frantic image of figures dragging a person across a field at night. The sound is a sudden, sharp, percussive bang. This is the psychological state of learned helplessness. The follower, isolated from the outside world and betrayed by their own family members, who may have participated in their shaming, eventually stops resisting. They accept the abuse as proof of their own spiritual inadequacy, and believe that the only way back to safety is through perfect devotion to the source of the pain. The mind breaks and the member begins to love their oppressor. A final, grotesque victory for the leader. The historical mystery of the dark retreats, the hidden horror behind the utopian facade, is often unveiled only years later. Through the fragmented testimonies of children who managed to escape, they tell of secret rooms, forced silence, and the utter confusion of a world where kindness was conditional and cruelty was divine. The community was an absolute psychological prison, one built not of stone and iron but of shame, fear, and shattered family loyalty. The ultimate moral of the dark retreat is a warning to the American audience. Freedom without accountability breeds totalitarianism. The physical isolation that America's founders sought for religious freedom becomes the perfect condition for absolute tyranny, a medieval kingdom of terror flourishing in the heart of the modern world. We now arrive at the darkest conclusion of the cult phenomenon, the moment the eschatology, the prophecy of the end, transcends mere belief and becomes a final command. This is the ultimate act of self-destruction, where the very fragility of the human mind is weaponized by the prophet to achieve a collective, irreversible, and horrifying conclusion. The poison chalice is offered not as a threat, but as a glorious exit strategy. The logic that leads to mass suicide or violent confrontation is a chilling sequence of psychological escalations. It begins with absolute isolation, the wall of isolation, and the creation of a common enemy, whispers of the apocalypse. The prophet convinces the followers that the outside world is not just evil, but actively and immediately planning their demise. This is the peak of the conspiracy narrative, but here is the detail that truly matters. The prophet must convince the followers that death is the ultimate act of loyalty and escape. Earthly existence is reframed as a meaningless, tainted prelude. Death, therefore, is not the end. It is the sudden, spectacular transition to the promised paradise, a final pattern interrupt that ends the cycle of suffering and fear. This narrative gives the follower a sense of power and control in a life where all agency has been stripped away. They are not victims. They are martyrs of destiny. Pause and consider this image. A simple cup, perhaps wooden or plain ceramic, shown close up, the shadows deep. The sound is a magnified heartbeat, slow and heavy. The final descent is triggered by external pressure. A child custody battle, a financial fraud investigation, or the arrival of law enforcement on the compound's perimeter is not viewed as a legal challenge. It is the fulfillment of prophecy. The prophet uses the intrusion, the inevitable government betrayal, as the final piece of evidence needed to justify the irreversible act. The siege mentality, nurtured for years, suddenly becomes reality, compelling the followers to execute the final, deadly script. In historical cases of mass confrontation, the prophet often utilized a tiered hierarchy of violence. The most fanatical inner circle, the true believers, were placed in positions to ensure compliance from the wavering members. They became the enforcers of the final command, preventing escape and administering the poison or weapons. This is the ultimate horrific expression of horizontal policing, where the followers police their own destruction. The psychological coercion is absolute because the alternative is presented as unthinkable. To survive means being captured by the demonic outside world, tortured and spending eternity in spiritual damnation. The choice is framed not as life or death, but as salvation or eternal suffering. Given their total psychological dependence on the prophet's reality, the choice for the exhausted and traumatized follower is tragically clear. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Notes and manifestos left behind by members often detail this horrifying logic. They express sadness for their deaths, but a profound certainty that their action is necessary to save their souls and to complete the prophet's mission. These documents reveal the crushing success of the cult leader's manipulation. He has so completely restructured their reality that their final mortal act is the only logical choice left to them. The final financial sacrifice is their life insurance policy for the afterlife. The cult's final act of self-destruction is simultaneously an act of absolute loyalty and the prophet's final, desperate attempt to secure his immortal legacy. If the world ends, the prophet wins. If the cult is destroyed, the prophet is martyred by the wicked world, and his truth is preserved in the violence of his ending. The leader utilizes the medieval-style narrative of the righteous fortress under siege. They tell the followers they are the final few holding back the tide of darkness. This hyper-dramatization of their plight elevates their status and justifies the use of violence against the invading forces, be they police or military. The cult, having already surrendered all assets, the cult of the purse, now willingly surrenders their last asset, their lives. But here's the detail that truly matters. In nearly all cases of mass self-destruction, the violence is preceded by a severe decline in the prophet's mental state. Increased paranoia, erratic revelations, and extreme cruelty become commonplace. The dark retreat. The followers, conditioned by years of abuse and learned helplessness, interpret this escalating madness not as a sign of mental collapse, but as the prophet's struggle with demonic forces or the intensity of his divine connection. The fragility of the human mind under duress ensures that the members double down on their obedience just when their leader becomes most dangerous. Pause and consider this image. A simple, closed wooden coffin, seen from a distance surrounded by uniformed dirt mounds. The sound is the echo of a single distant gunshot. The final act is an ultimate rejection of the American system. By choosing mass death or conflict, the cult achieves the total secession they always desired. They are no longer bound by American law, taxes, or social contracts. The prophet ensures that his kingdom achieves its final, dark sovereignty through its own destruction. This leaves behind a chilling historical mystery for the surviving American public. The incomprehensible depth of psychological control that could compel a seemingly normal population to such a collective, self-inflicted end. The destruction is a terrifying validation of the prophet's core conspiracy. The world was out to get them. The tragedy is that the cult leader orchestrated the violence, using the inevitable intervention of the state, the government betrayal, to confirm his narrative. He weaponized the American public's own fears of secret societies and imminent collapse against his followers. The poisoned chalice is a monument to the power of engineered dread. It proves that the human mind, when totally isolated, financially dependent, and conditioned to believe in an imminent violent end, will choose the ultimate sacrifice over the terrifying prospect of regaining its own freedom and facing the shame of its mistakes. The cult's final act is not a tragedy of faith, but a triumph of absolute psychological manipulation. We have witnessed the life cycle of the cult, from the prophet's initial promise to the final act of destruction. Now we must examine the unintended enduring legacy of these absolute systems. The children, the post-traumatic generation, who were born and raised inside the wall of isolation, and who struggle to find normality in the outside world, is the final, chilling measure of the cult's devastating power. These children did not choose the cult. They inherited its absolute reality from birth. Their minds were formed under the rule of the prophet and the relentless fear of the apocalypse. They were raised without traditional family loyalty, social context, or the fundamental ability to question authority. The cult's doctrine was not a belief system. It was the undisputed air they breathed. But here is the detail that truly matters. These children were deliberately deprived of critical thinking skills. Their education was entirely sectarian, designed only to reinforce the prophet's teachings and the evil of the outside world. Any external knowledge, basic history, science, or civics, was withheld or radically altered. This lack of a baseline reality is the first great obstacle they face upon escape. They emerge into the world not as citizens but as strangers in a foreign land, unable to navigate simple social rules or cultural norms. Pause and consider this image. A young, pale face staring out from a dark window, eyes wide with anxiety. The sound is the distant, confusing noise of city traffic. The trauma is compounded by the emotional starvation enforced by the communal structures. In cults built on celibacy like the Shakers or communal marriage like Oneida, children were often denied the consistent, unconditional love of a single parent. Their affection was channeled toward the abstract ideal of the community or the demanding figure of the prophet. They were taught that love is conditional upon obedience and performance. This leads to profound lifelong difficulties in forming stable, trusting relationships outside the cult. For many children, the government betrayal narrative was literalized through fear. They were taught that the police, the federal agents, or the social workers were demonic agents coming to capture them, separate them, and condemn their souls. When an intervention finally does occur, a police raid, a rescue, the event confirms their darkest, most ingrained paranoia. The rescue is experienced not as liberation, but as the apocalypse foretold. The trauma of the escape itself becomes a final psychological anchor, forever tying their fear to the memory of the prophet's warnings. The most tragic psychological wound is the lack of self-concept. In the cult, their identity was defined entirely by their role in the prophet's mission. Once outside, that identity vanishes. They are left with a terrifying historical mystery. Who am I without the apocalypse? They possess no individual goals, no personal ambition, and no learned ability to make independent choices, having lived under the absolute authority of the prophet every minute of their lives. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. Testimonies from adult survivors consistently highlight the shocking difficulty of understanding money and commerce. Raised in a communal system where corporate greed was condemned but secretly practiced by the leaders, they possess no concept of saving, debt, or earned income. The simplest act of opening a bank account or applying for a job becomes an overwhelming, paralyzing confrontation with the alien logic of the outside world. Their financial innocence is a brutal handicap. The challenge for the post-traumatic generation is not just adapting to a new world. It is deconstructing the old one. The prophet's reality, the belief in the imminence of the end, the evil of outsiders, the necessity of absolute obedience, remains a powerful, haunting force in their minds. These are the ghosts of absolute reality. The primary struggle is moral autonomy. Cult survivors were trained to believe that their personal conscience was flawed, and that morality resides only in the command of the prophet. Outside the cult, they are suddenly forced to make moral choices without the safety net of an infallible leader. This often leads to crippling anxiety, an inability to trust their own judgment, and a vulnerability to new, simpler, authoritative voices. The fragility of the human mind is permanent. But here is the detail that truly matters. Many survivors struggle with a profound internal sense of disappointment and meaninglessness. They were promised a magnificent cosmic destiny, to rule the world with the prophet, to watch the apocalypse from the sanctuary. Instead, they got a meager, ordinary life in a world they were taught was unworthy. The emotional escalation required to believe in the cult's reality leaves them unable to find satisfaction in the moderate, nuanced reality of modern American life. They feel they have been robbed of their divine purpose. Pause and consider this image. A close-up on a person's hands trembling slightly as they hold a public school textbook. The sound is a low internal ringing like auditory hallucination. The recovery process is a terrifying journey to re-establish external points of reference. They must learn often as adults that the history they were taught was a lie, that the corporate empire of the cult was simply financial exploitation, and that the demonic agents were actually trauma counselors. This confrontation with years of accepted deception is intensely painful, and often leads to severe identity crises and emotional breakdowns. They must effectively reparent themselves in adulthood, learning basic emotional and social literacy. The final dark inheritance of the cult is the tendency toward internalized policing. Even years after leaving, the survivor's mind often maintains the surveillance and shame mechanisms of the compound. They struggle with chronic guilt, self-censorship, and paranoia, constantly waiting for the absent prophet's retribution or the public shaming that no longer exists. They are living under the rule of a medieval-style ghost monarchy in their own minds. The post-traumatic generation is the enduring proof that the cult's destruction is not the end of the story. It is simply the beginning of a different, more isolated struggle. Their lifelong fight to integrate, to feel safe, to trust love, and to reclaim the right to think for themselves is the true cost of America's dark history of absolute cult control. They are the living casualties of the prophet's absolute ambition. We conclude our investigation by turning from the 19th century frontier to the 21st century digital landscape. The physical compound is no longer necessary. The prophet has simply traded the vast, empty desert of Utah for the infinite, unmonitored space of the internet. The psychological mechanisms of coercion, perfected by figures like Mother Ann Lee and Brigham Young, have not vanished. They have merely upgraded their technology. The core American anxiety today is no longer just the fear of hellfire, but the fear of meaninglessness, information overload, and systemic corruption. The modern cult leader capitalizes on this dread by offering the ultimate conspiracy. They don't just reinterpret the Bible. They offer a secret key to understanding all global events, from economic crises to political movements. This is the new eschatology. The imminent end is not fire and brimstone, but societal collapse or a deep state takeover. But here's the detail that truly matters. The internet has made the wall of isolation infinitely more efficient. The physical barrier is replaced by the algorithmic barrier. Members are recruited through targeted social media feeds, then moved into private encrypted chat groups. This digital sanctuary provides the same psychological effect as a walled compound. Information control is total and instantaneous. The member only sees the content filtered and approved by the prophet and their inner circle. External contradictory information, news, family warnings, critical thought, is instantly dismissed as fake news or government propaganda. Pause and consider this image. A smartphone screen showing a rapid stream of chaotic, conflicting headlines which suddenly snaps to a single, calming authoritative text post. The sound is the sharp click of a lock. The modern leader maintains the cult of the purse through digital means. Instead of signing over property deeds, members are coerced into purchasing expensive, proprietary knowledge products, cryptic digital currencies, or multi-level marketing schemes. This corporate greed is redefined as an act of financial rebellion against the corrupt fiat system. The followers' investment is not just money, it is a badge of their secret knowledge, ensuring that the sunk cost fallacy applies to their digital wallet as well as their soul. Furthermore, the internet allows the leader to achieve perfect pattern interruption. Historical prophets had to wait for revival meetings. The modern prophet can deliver an urgent, fear-inducing revelation via encrypted broadcast at 3 a.m. This constant, unpredictable flood of information keeps the followers in a perpetual state of hypervigilance and emotional dependence, exactly replicating the fragility of the human mind we saw in the burned-over district. The medieval structure is preserved. The prophet is the digital king. The inner circle are the online moderators and enforcers, and the followers are the anonymous foot soldiers who spread the gospel and harass dissenters in the comments section. The surveillance is not done through public confession, but through total digital transparency, where every post, like, and private message is a testament to the member's loyalty. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The new legal challenge is not fighting for land deeds, but fighting for digital identity. Lawsuits and platform bans show that the leader, upon being exposed, often tries to seize the members' private accounts, effectively deleting their digital existence and severing their final communication links. The prophet's power is now the power to make the follower disappear from the public record. The most profound echo of the past is the concept of the immortal cult of personality. The historical prophet's influence died with his body. The modern prophet, however, can achieve digital immortality through thousands of hours of recorded content, archived streams, and generated AI voices. The prophet's absolute authority can be perpetually recycled, instructing the followers long after the human body is gone. The post-traumatic generation of the future will not struggle against a ghost. They will struggle against a perfect, relentless algorithm of trauma. The digital age has also intensified the cult's appeal to the marginalized and the vulnerable. Those who feel unseen or ignored by the mainstream are instantly given an exclusive, high-status identity in the private chat rooms. The ultimate conspiracy theory validates their personal feelings of being persecuted or betrayed by the system, government betrayal, making the prophet's virtual sanctuary feel like the only safe harbor left on Earth. But here is the detail that truly matters. The anonymity of the internet allows the leader to recruit and operate without the physical accountability that eventually brought down the earlier cults. There is no compound to raid, no city to march against, and often no single legal jurisdiction to challenge the prophet. The leader can be physically located in one country, while his financial exploitation is managed through offshore accounts, and his internal nightmare of abuse is conducted via encrypted video calls. The historical mystery of what goes on behind the compound walls has been replaced by the untraceable mystery of end-to-end encryption. Pause and consider this image. A lone figure sitting in a dark room, illuminated only by the light of a laptop screen, typing furiously. The sound is a sharp electronic ping followed by silence. The emotional escalation in the digital age is more acute because the recruitment is faster and the isolation is more pervasive. The follower is separated not by miles of desert, but by the thickness of a digital screen, a barrier that is psychologically harder to cross because it appears voluntary. The follower can be sitting next to their spouse or parent and still be entirely isolated in the prophet's reality bubble. This pervasive, intimate isolation is the ultimate refinement of the cult leader's art. The ultimate moral of the digital age is a terrifying conclusion. The American cult is not a historical artifact. It is a permanent feature of the human condition, perfectly adapted to the technology of its time. The thirst for certainty, the fear of the unknown, and the willingness to surrender individual freedom to a charismatic voice promising a secret, ultimate truth remain the deepest vulnerabilities of the human mind. The poison chalice is now a digital download, but the price remains the same: absolute obedience and the total surrender of the self. The final warning is that the walls of the modern cult are invisible, and the prophet is waiting for you to click join. The terrifying core of the modern system is the cult's mastery of manufactured consensus. In the past, the followers had to physically see their neighbors shaking or speaking in tongues to confirm the shared delusion. Today, that is replaced by the visible count of followers, the flood of positive testimonials, and the rapid, overwhelming affirmation in the private chat forums. This constant digital applause creates a powerful sense of belonging and validation, a psychological reward that far outweighs the shame of surrendering one's savings or family ties. But here is the detail that truly matters. The leader often uses AI-generated content and deepfakes as the new revelation. Where George Rapp claimed God spoke to him, the modern prophet uses manipulated video or audio to show proof of the conspiracy, the government betrayal, or the imminent arrival of the apocalypse. This technologically advanced deception is incredibly potent because it appeals directly to the American public's generalized anxiety about media manipulation and the inability to trust their own eyes and ears. The fragility of the human mind is exploited by technology that blurs the line between reality and simulation. Pause and consider this image. A distorted video of a news broadcast, the speaker's mouth moving slightly out of sync. The sound is a sudden, sharp, low-frequency hum. The final act of financial exploitation is now often cloaked in the language of digital empowerment. The cult demands that followers invest in obscure cryptocurrency schemes, specialized training packages, or encrypted servers, all framed as necessary tools for survival in the post-collapse world. This is not just a transfer of wealth, it is a transfer of digital agency. The prophet gains control over the followers' private keys and digital identity, effectively locking them out of the modern financial system should they choose to escape. The corporate greed has evolved from controlling land deeds to controlling crypto wallets. The modern cult leader also perfects the art of recruiting the traumatized. They seek out individuals who have already been alienated, whether by the pandemic, political polarization, or economic collapse. They offer not just certainty, but a complete identity framework that explains why they are suffering. Their pain is not random. It is part of a grand secret war. And by joining the prophet, they become soldiers in this magnificent secret conflict. This elevates their status from victim to cosmic warrior, making the cult the only place where their suffering makes sense. The post-traumatic generation of the future faces a unique horror. The cult's ideology may persist, even if the community dissolves. The digital footprint, the archived videos, the encrypted documents, the chat logs, can be accessed years later, threatening the survivor with perpetual re-traumatization and the terrifying possibility of relapse into the digital reality bubble. The historical mystery is no longer in a remote compound, but saved on a hard drive. The final chilling conclusion is that the principles of control have remained entirely consistent for over 2 centuries. The modern world has simply provided the prophets with the perfect, frictionless tools to amplify fear, exploit isolation, and demand absolute obedience at scale. The promise of paradise in Pennsylvania has become the promise of salvation in a private chat room, but the cost remains the surrender of the self. The ultimate moral is a perpetual warning. America's religious freedom provided the space for cults to be born. The digital age provided the tools for them to become virtually immortal.